What are the training implications for these sorts of trends? It depends what sport you're talking about, but if I concentrate perhaps on soccer and AFL, powerful athletes, both aerobic and anaerobic. I mean, the aerobic nature is going to help in terms of recovery, although in soccer, because of the very long stop periods occasionally, there's probably a little less emphasis on that in terms of the selection pressure than there would be on this. And all sports, all three that I've shown, would be a greater emphasis on aspects of anaerobic power and capacity and the ability to reproduce high intensity efforts rapidly, certainly in rugby, in AFL, in more recent times, which I won't go through here. So rapid recovery is very important. Repeated efforts within play periods, particularly in the rugby code and in AFL, but even for some periods in soccer where the play is quite continuous. Quick decision making, the player density, as I mentioned before. If player density goes up, you can imagine if you're surrounded by 2 players, and then it's not a linear relationship if you suddenly go to 3 players in terms of an extra 50% demand. It goes up in an accelerated way in terms of opportunities and the requirements for skill and decision time. So increasing player density has an enormous effect on the ability of players and the demands on players to move quickly, think quickly, and have the skills to execute quickly in that high traffic condition. The load and the game specificity. I'll talk about load just briefly to finish off with, and the ball skill under fatigue conditions. The player loads, as I mentioned the other day in the symposium that we had here, that all game demands, all sports are showing increased game demand. So players are pushing the red line in all codes, no matter what, they're all pushing it. So it doesn't matter if you get a long stoppage, then you go faster when it starts again. So no matter what the environmental conditions in terms of the structure of the game, players will red line it as much as they can if they think it's going to give them an advantage. Player efficiencies, I won't talk about that. What drives speed? It's something that we see speed such a critical element in most games. Rugby is a little bit different, but even when the ball is released, the speed in rugby is going up. So I didn't talk about that, but when it is released, it's a very much faster game than it used to be, and often that's both movement and skills. But what drives speed? I mentioned in the session this morning that there has been at least 3 or 4 or more presentations that have skirted this issue of what's driving speed and the relationship between some element of speed, of movement or sprint or high intensity efforts during games and game involvement. Here, for example, is just some data that we collected. This was the A-League in soccer in Australia. The number of 2-second sprints per half, albeit with limitations on the GPS units, but this is a sort of pattern we get. Yes, it's a significant relationship, a lot of scatter, of course, but like the others who have presented in the last couple of days, it probably accounts for 10 or 15% of the variance in game involvement. And also in the AFL champion rating score, we have many more data points than this, but this is all I had to put this graph together. But again, it's a significant relationship. The number of 2-second sprints that are undertaken in a game versus the champion ratings. I'm not even sure if they use those rating systems now, but that's from a couple of years ago. So speed is important, and we've seen it from others. It's not the be-all and end-all, but speed of movement and decision-making and explosive acceleration seems to be really important. We had a look at, again, this is AFL, we had a look at a whole range. I can't remember the number of videos we looked at, but there was significant across the season. And we looked at, with this software, to look at where teams had the ball, hot spots, the number of chains or number of links in a chain in terms of possession, the proportion of time spent in the corridor for those AFL people here versus on the wing, how far they got in a kick out before it was turned over, a whole range of different variables, and we looked at just correlating any and all of those. It was a bit of a scattergun approach, I'll admit it, at what was associated with the probability of winning a quarter. Like I say, we broke it down into a quarter like someone else had done in a talk here. The only things that came up in terms of game success, or in this case quarter success, the only things that came up were the time and possession, which is probably no surprise, and forward speed, when you get the ball to move it fast. So they were the only things that came out as significant indicators, and they weren't that highly correlated, but they were significantly correlated with the probability of winning a quarter. So speed across all those studies and my information is important, there's no question about it, but it is obviously a less than probably about 15% of the variance. So what implications do we have here? Performance differs according to many factors. If we look, and this is another, I guess, if you like, some evidence to say that speed is important. When you look at the competition level, and you look at this stage, it was Super 14 versus international matches, now Super 15. But we found that going from Super 14 to international levels, so another increment up in terms of the quality of the play, was in the order of 11% faster in terms of ball movement once it was released. So much more skill, much faster movements, 8% more total work rate, 8% more work rate in terms of its movement, locomotion per minute. There was less walking, there was more jogging, striding and sprinting. So movement is critical, speed is critical in the ways that I've described. Another piece of evidence here with colleague Darren Burgess and Geraldine Norton in Australia. We looked at under 18s in the AFL from 2002-2009. We looked at sort of an average speed times total play time or work units across that time. You can see both in speed itself and also these work units, it's increasing. This is for AFL players at the professional level, and this is a season of under 18s, under 18 games in 2002 and in 2009. So you can see even at the under 18 level, the work units are increasing, and that's a significant increase. But what was more significant is that the gap between under 18s and senior level there and the under 18s and senior level there is growing wider. So the step up required in a sport like AFL is getting harder for 18-year-olds, and in Australia they're drafted at 18. It's probably one of the very few sports in the world where 18-year-olds can play such a collision-based sport against fully grown adults at such a young age. And there have been in the past examples of even 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, although that's been outlawed by policy. Other consequences, as my final point, of increasing speed, and particularly in relation to congested play. In the World Cup, the increased density in soccer, in AFL, the increased density, the rehearsal games, the practice that you need to practice your quick thinking and skills, all involve minor games and games that are high in density. This is a GPS tracking summary, just a few seconds here from a zero start up to about 20 kilometres an hour. So this is speed here up to about 21 kilometres an hour. And superimposed over that we have the accelerometry data in terms of g-forces here. And the important thing is that this is the acceleration phase. There is relatively high g-forces at 7 here in the acceleration phase, but it's the deceleration phase here where you go off the scale a little bit, 8, 9, 10 g-forces when you decelerate. So the load then on the bones, on the muscles, on the joints of players is much greater when you have a congested game, when you're playing small games, when you have high player density in games. Some more data here to show this point. This is across a game in soccer in the A-League. This is a variation in speed across the game. When you superimpose that, on top of that, the g-forces here, so this is accelerometry data. So most of it's pretty low here at walking at 1 and a bit, 2s and 3s for your g-forces, and occasionally you get a bit more when they might have a bit of body contact or deceleration or whatever. That's in a full-size A-League game, and then we set up some minor games where the density increased and this is the G-forces now associated with smaller, higher density games. These are the G-forces. Put them together, that's a normal soccer game with the G-forces. This is the G-forces in a modified, small-sided, high density game, and you get much more longer sprints, obviously, hardly any long sprints, but a lot more wear and tear on the body, a lot more stresses through the body with those G-forces. In summary then, all sports are evolving. I think for conditioning people, if they're interested in this sort of thing, is to determine game demands, to measure game demands in ways that might give you information about motion, accelerations, and most people are doing that. Understand, if possible, the implications of fast ball movements, fast player speeds, and certainly player density, and how to measure and record that and use it in your development of training. And it helps also to quantify the step up required between the levels. And part of what you might do is also audit the drills for these types of measures so that it becomes more specific when you want to overlay in a similar way that Eddie Jones had done many years before. Thank you very much.